Good morning, everyone. My name is Chansa Mwenda, the Senior Programs Manager at the American Chamber of Commerce in Zambia. The American Chamber of Commerce is an organization that promotes trade and investment between Zambia and the US. And I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to watch this discussion, where we will be talking about the impact that the COVID-19 will have on the economy here in Zambia. I would like to thank our panelists for joining us today and for being a part of this discussion. So we have all seen the devastating effects that the pandemic has had on the economy, and today we just want to bring it down to the nation to address some of the key issues that will affect the different sectors in our country. I'll allow our panelists and our moderator to introduce themselves, and thereafter our moderator, Humphrey, will take charge of the discussion. Humphrey.
Thank you, Chansa. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and again, a warm welcome to this panel discussion. As Chansa says, we are focusing on COVID-19 today, which I guess is unsurprising. It's a disease that stemmed from China just a few months ago. It has spread through Asia, ravaged Europe and the Americas, and is now firmly on our continent, Africa. As of yesterday, there were some 3 million, I think, cases worldwide, over 200,000 deaths. Locally in Zambia, as of yesterday, we had 89 confirmed cases, and sadly 3 deaths. So it's clearly a major health catastrophe. But beyond that, it's also caused an economic crisis globally. And as Chansa says, that's exactly what we want to discuss today. A warm welcome again, ladies and gentlemen. I'll now introduce the panelists. My name is Humphrey Mlenga, I'm managing partner at Deloitte. I'll start with Dr. Sahili. He's the CEO for Medland Hospital. He's a medical doctor by profession, and currently serves on a number of boards, including AmCham, but also Olympic Youth Development Center, or OYDC. He is at Zulu. She's the legal head at British American Tobacco. She's also currently the vice chair of the Zambia Association of Manufacturers and the past CEO of ZAM as well. And finally, we've got Danishas Makunka. He's a CEO for Longhorn. He's a chartered accountant by profession, but he's also read economics. Spent 20 years at Bank of Zambia and served on a number of boards, including at the Zambia National Building Society, but also at the Kwacha Pension Trust Fund. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So perhaps just to kick off the discussion, we'll start with some basics. Dr. Sahili, maybe you can just give us a quick snapshot of what COVID is and what we're grappling with here.
Okay, so COVID-19 is an infectious disease. It is not a virus. This is the name of the disease itself. And that disease was declared as a pandemic by the WHO at the beginning of the year. It has started, as you said, in Wuhan, China. Before that, it was an unknown disease. But what is the virus that is causing that disease? It's part of a large family of viruses that can cause illness, whether in animals or in humans. But having said that, we have to stress on the fact that COVID-19 is a disease that is spread from human to human. We have seen different versions of that virus. For example, we already call the SARS or MERS. So these are types of disease that were caused by viruses from the same family.
Thank you very much for that quick overview. Maybe another question. So, when you look at what has happened in Europe and the Americas, it's been carnage, quite frankly, over there. Yeah. Back in Africa, and Zambia specifically, it's been benign, one could argue. So, for example, our first case was on the 18th of March. Since then, we have had 3 deaths, sadly, but then not as bad as we thought it would be. What could be happening here, Dr. Sahili?
Well, honestly, we have to stress on one fact before we, this is something that I believe in, is that whatever is happening is very new. Therefore, all the studies are still very young, if not to say immature, and whatever we may say may be different the next day. One example of that is the rate of death. We were all looking at the mortality rate worldwide, and we were saying that this is a very high mortality rate resulting from COVID-19. Now, with increasing the number of tests that are done for larger population, that is also allowing us to discover that we have a lot of asymptomatic patients that lead us to reduce that mortality rate. So that doesn't mean that the disease is less harmful, but the numbers have changed. So having said that, we also would like to stress on the fact that this disease, as I said in the beginning, it's a human-to-human transmission. Therefore, in Africa, yes, we had the cases a bit later than Europe or the US, but this is also due to the fact that we needed people who are coming from affected areas to travel into the continent. One factor that may not be in our favor as a continent is the fact that we don't have enough tests to be done randomly to a larger number of people. And that may a little bit mask the number of asymptomatic patients. The other fact is that we are a young population in Africa. So as of yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, we have a little bit more than 21,000 cases in all Africa, cumulative cases. If we look at the states, we are looking at 1 million. That doesn't mean that the continent is not affected by the coronavirus, but that means that we, one, lack a number of tests to be done. Two, we have a younger population. And three, we have also a huge proportion of our population living in rural areas, and they don't have access to health facilities. Therefore, they don't have access, even if the tests are available, they don't have access to those tests as easier as it can be in developed countries.
And that's very insightful. So we shouldn't be complacent, I suppose. It's an unknown disease, and there could still be challenges ahead of us. I'll come back to health. Let me just move on to some economic issues a little bit here. So COVID-19, as we said, is now causing economic challenges, Chipego. Many countries are shut to some degree. In the context of Zambia, what could you say are the major impacts on the economy from COVID-19?
Okay, I'll take it from a manufacturing perspective. Thank you, Humphrey. So just to start off with, in terms of Africa, one of the first countries we saw shutting down that had a major impact on us, or locking down, was South Africa. And as manufacturers, or as the manufacturing sector, as the Zambian economy in general, we do source a lot of our inputs, our finished products from South Africa. And that lockdown came as quite a surprise. It was very immediate, very sudden. And as a result of that, there were a number of challenges that were faced by manufacturers, generally by Zambia, specifically when looking at where are we going to source our product from, how are we going to get our inputs. And there were delays with regards to the movement of cargo from South Africa to Zambia. And that was one of the first major impacts that was felt by the Zambian economy.
Right.
As a result of that, of course, I think what we've seen going forward is increased bilateral discussions between Zambia and South Africa to really establish how we can work together in the midst of the COVID pandemic, recognizing, of course, the fact that Zambia is a landlocked, land-linked, depending on how you're looking at it. Yes, it's a landlocked country. And so what we saw is South Africa shuts down, and we begin to see other economies in Southern Africa begin to lock down. And what that effectively did to Zambia was put us in the situation where artificially, we were basically landlocked, and the question becomes, how do we source our products? How do we source our inputs? So for manufacturers in Zambia, that was a major concern, because a huge number of our inputs that go into the manufacturing process are actually sourced from South Africa. So there were quite a significant amount of engagements right at the beginning of South Africa's 21 days to make sure that cargo could come across. Now, of course, when you're looking at the movement of cargo, it stands to reason that you have to address the aspect of the movement of people who are bringing the cargo into Zambia.
Right.
And at the border, obviously, there are all those measures that have been put in place now to address quarantining of drivers and so on. So there are the delays. For the most part, they've been resolved, but that has caused a slowdown in terms of the economic performance of Zambia.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point, Chipego. So supply chain significantly adversely impacted. Maybe I can turn to Denicius now, just to build on what Chipego said. What does all of that mean in terms of the impact on the overall economy from a GDP, maybe tax revenue perspective, Denicius?
No, thanks very much. First of all, before we come to analyzing what the impact is, this disease is going to have on the domestic economy, it's better, first of all, we look at it from the global angle and identify the risk transmission mechanisms. Globally, this has hit the biggest economies. We're talking about the US, China, and the Eurozone, due to containment measures ranging in terms of severity, total lockdowns, and in some cases partial, even none, like in Sweden. So what this has entailed is that people have, especially in total lockdowns, people have been told not to move. Obviously, output gets affected. People's incomes dwindle. Already in the US, the number of claims, the number of people filing for unemployment claims has actually risen. I think last time I checked was close to about 30 million.
Right.
A lot in the something that has happened like first in the history of this country. Maybe it's only comparable to what happened during the Great Depression years that followed. So jobs which took about 10 years to create disappeared over a period of just about 2 months, which is actually a very, very sad thing. So, but what does that entail basically? It entails that, you see, these countries' economies contract. The contraction in these countries' economies entails that external demand, for goods that they may import, from countries like ours, Zambia, would be affected. So the shrinkage in imports, the slowed external demand for commodities like copper will entail that the copper prices will come down. So this is one risk transmission mechanism which is actually affecting us, and I've seen the performance of copper on the international market. The copper prices at levels which are very, very much undervalued. We're supposed to be recording much, much higher than that. So we know that Zambia is a commodity-dependent country, highly dependent on copper, and so is its currency.
Right.
The Zambian kwacha is pretty much a commodity currency.
Right.
So we've seen in the last couple of weeks that you see the exchange rate has actually depreciated so very much, from levels around about 13, 14 to where we are close to about 19 kwacha to $1 US. So, so that in itself entails other things have to, kick in. Being an import-oriented economy, a lot of things have to be imported. We just talked about the fact that there's a lot of trade between Zambia and South Africa, and that disruption has affected manufacturing to a great extent. So now, when we import a lot of goods, it actually means inflation has got to also go up. The pass-through effects of inflation due to the exchange rate is quite high in Zambia. There's a high transmission power. So inflation goes up, obviously that entails the monetary policy authorities have got to respond, either by way of raising interest rates like we saw some time back. So now, with the reduced demand for copper earnings also go down. That entails that, you see, the foreign exchange available, it goes down. The amount of revenue that the country can generate from copper goes down. So resulting in the expansion in the budget deficit. So apart from just the amount that the government is going to spend to contain or to manage the COVID-19, there's already a big shrinkage in terms of the pace, which the government would ordinarily have gotten from the export of copper. So this is basically, in a way, is going to impact our economy very much. So expected economic output, production will suffer. And we know other sectors as well are going to feel the pain. So, in a nutshell, this is how we are going to be affected. This is the one classic example of how risks get propagated to domestic economies, which otherwise arise from countries which may be far away. But since we are in a global village, economies are interconnected, so are the global markets.
Thanks for that detailed analysis, Danishas. So you've touched on a number of aspects there: the exchange rate, inflation, copper prices, copper demand. So it's cross-cutting the impact. But you also touched on a little bit towards the end on the impact on some industry sectors in our country. And I'd like us to focus on that a little bit more to bring it to life in Zambia. Which sectors do you think will be most impacted?
Yes, a very good question. Already what we've seen, the one which has actually been the hardest hit, okay, of course, it is wide ranging in terms of the scale of the organizations we're talking about. We've got micro, small, medium, and large scale enterprises. From the very, very small enterprises, we are talking about, the bars, restaurants, and nightclubs. When I was coming, here, I was listening to some program on Radio Phoenix, and the chairperson of I think the Bar Association of Zambia was actually complaining that they've been badly hit.
Right.
So that's from the micro or the small SME side. Now on the other side, like the big corporates, we have seen tourism affected significantly. Now this is the one which has actually taken the biggest hit. About 3-4 weeks ago, the Minister of Tourism was estimating that the lost revenue already from the tourism sector is somewhere around about $22 million. So that we are likely, it's even likely to worsen, like Dr. Sali talked about. This is a novel virus. So a lot more is going to be known, and we don't even know, when the cure or the vaccines are going to be to arrive. So this may prolong for quite some time, and the further it prolongs, the bigger the impact. So tourism affected. The airline industry have actually seen, ProFlight and I think some others, down their planes. Those equally, are going to be, badly affected. How about the mining industry itself? The government has just had to fight back what the Mopani wanted to do to close shop for some time. So the mining industry, in terms of output, is going to be affected in terms of the price. So that is going to also take a hit. How about the transport sector, for example, public transport? Public transport, to the extent that social distancing has been implemented by the government, that is also going to take a hit. Manufacturing. Chipego talked about manufacturing.
In fact, I was going to ask Chipego on that one, given she comes from the Manufacturing Association. Thanks for that, Danishas. Chipego, manufacturing, what's the impact there? What are you seeing?
Okay, so we see both challenges and opportunities, more opportunities actually in this particular instance, because our national development plans have spoken to the fact that we need to invest in value addition. They've spoken about the fact that we need to industrialization. And our view is that the COVID-19 pandemic has actually, as terrible as it is, created an opportunity or really exposed Zambia to the fact that everything we've put in our national development plans actually needs to be realized. And if you have been following, which I'm sure you have, the various speeches that have been made by the Minister of Finance, by His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Zambia, what you see is an increased focus on the need to buy local, to source local, and all of this is espoused in our development plans, but really the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the efforts towards that. More recently, the Minister of Finance did create a task force, and initially it's starting between South Africa and Zambia, given the trade relationship and the need for the immediate actions between the two countries. But the idea there is to build value chains, Zambian value chain in particular. Local companies, local farmers have to supply or have to be given a room to supply or to be part of these supply chains. And that's particularly important if we're looking at fast-tracking the rate of recovery through the manufacturing sector or through value addition. Because once we are sourcing more locally, of course, we're building our base, the revenue is circulating within the country. We really begin to create companies that are much stronger, much more competitive, more connected. And if we're looking at it from a global perspective, if Zambia is able to address domestic value chains, regional value chains, there are more opportunities for growth for Zambian firms. If you're selling value-added products, more opportunities to earn. And when we're looking at the Forex issue at the end of the day, if we are building Zambian firms with export capabilities that are able to earn that foreign exchange for Zambia, it stands to reason that the dependency on commodities such as copper will, over time, it won't be immediate, but will in the medium to long term can actually reduce. Therefore, addressing that aspect of our exposure to external shocks and enabling the country as a whole to respond more positively when we encounter scenarios like this. So there are opportunities for manufacturing, and from the outset, I think right at the beginning of, or the onset of the COVID pandemic, you saw a number of sectors coming to the fore, the hygiene and cleaning products, even the engineering sector actually, with the production of innovative hand washing stations, for instance, and the plastic sector as well. So it's not that Zambia doesn't have the capacity to do this, but really COVID-19 has created the space for the manufacturing sector. Of course, within the sector, there are certain sectors that are still struggling as a result of the pandemic, and their interventions will probably come to light more in the medium to long term, where we begin to look at how to enhance value chains with the construction sector, for instance, or infrastructure, where we begin to say, if I have a massive project that's coming to Zambia, am I using local materials to feed into that process? Are we buying local? Are we supporting and empowering Zambians to be able to contribute more to the Zambian economy and GDP? Yeah. So more opportunities than challenges. Of course, right now we have a number of teething problems, but I think we're very privileged to have the opportunity to really have a direct interface with the government to make sure that where we see the challenges, we're able to address them.
Yeah. So I guess there's a silver lining to all of this. I think in summary, it's not all gloom and doom. Local industries can pick up and fill the gap, as it were. Dr. Saidi, the health sector, what's the impact there? I mean, can we cope as a country if what's happening in America comes here as well?
Well, I don't think there is a country that is coping with the pandemic. And to be quite honest, this disease does not differentiate between a sector or another, or even between gender or nationality. So, if we take the impact on the manufacturing sector or the tourism sector, this is worldwide, and the impact on the healthcare sector is also a big impact. But I see it also as an opportunity, to be quite honest, and I don't think this will please a lot of people. I see it as an opportunity. It's like a call for us, like a call, the bell now is rang, and we just have to proceed and to say, okay, this is what I will do post COVID-19. Meaning that, yes, opportunities are here for local manufacturing, and we have been battling for that. I mean, from my previous also experience in manufacturing, we've been battling for this for a long time. But that doesn't come alone. For us to build a local manufacturer and to boost that local manufacturing, we need also to empower the skills. In order to empower the skills, we need the education sector to be a strong sector, so that they can also train the people and the youth mainly, and help them going into sectors that they didn't think about it, because we see that we have a large number of young citizens that are going in specific schools or universities, and they are just ignoring other sectors. If I take, for example, the healthcare sector, everyone wants to become a nurse, a midwife, or a doctor, but that doesn't stop there. We still need radiology technicians, people who are trained on doing MRIs, CT scans. We need specialized nurses in ICU, in cardiac surgery, in anesthesia. We need doctors that have also the opportunity to work, what we call today, everyone is talking about working remotely. Well, we need to empower that telemedicine and telesurveillance. So can we cope with it as a country? I think we have our challenges. We have a limited capacity of beds. This is, and this is not only limited to Zambia. That's worldwide. What people are doing now, and I will take the example of some countries that are now lifting or slightly lifting some lockdowns. What they have done during their lockdowns is that they have increased their capacity in different sectors. For instance, the healthcare sector, they increased their capacity through empowering local manufacturers of ventilators, of hospital beds, proper hospital beds. They took the hygiene measures that are needed, and therefore they have even shifted some conference centers into kind of hospitals or emergency clinics or healthcare facilities. So during the lockdowns, they took the lesson, and they immediately started the plan for post-COVID-19. We all know that we cannot be locked down, even if we are not officially locked down, but we cannot be there for more than 1 month, 2 months. How long can a country cope with that?
Yeah.
We are going to open all the other sectors, even the bars, for example. They are going to open slightly.
Yeah.
But we need to know what are we going to do post-COVID-19. And therefore, this is the role that the healthcare sector has to play so that we are ready post-COVID-19. This disease will not end. And if someone is believing that the vaccine will come in 1 month or 2, then this is just, I mean, sorry to say that, but it's a joke.
Many months down the road, yeah.
We need time to, even if the vaccine is created, we need time to produce it.
Yeah.
So until that time comes in, the COVID-19 will still be here and the coronavirus will still be present for it to move from one person to another. So we have a major role to play. One of the disadvantages that we have in Zambia, for example, we've always said we are a land-linked country. Now, as Mrs. Sulu has said, it's obvious we are a landlocked country as well. We rely a lot on imports of pharmaceutical products.
Yes.
And therefore, we need to empower on a later stage the manufacturing of pharmaceutical goods. But for now, we need also to send a call to the general population. There is no need for you to go and buy all the drugs that you think are related to COVID-19. Leave that to when we, healthcare providers, are in real need of those goods and we need to supply you as patients with that. There is no need to stock up so that we can sell it at a higher price in the future. It doesn't harm anyone, it just harms the whole country. The same applies to, for example, people who are going and looking for tests. And here I have to put that comment. We have what we call the antigen rapid test,
yes.
and they are not efficient. The sensitivity is very low, medically speaking, and therefore we can have a huge number of false negatives.
Right.
So unless it is a rapid test antibody-based, there is no need to go for that. But I'm seeing people who are asking kindly to do the test, and they have no symptoms, and they have not been in contact with anyone suspect of COVID-19. So why do you need to do the test?
Right.
If you are self-isolating yourself or you are taking the measures that are announced by the Ministry of Health, then you are at less risk, and keep the test for people who are really in need of the test.
No.
So those challenges we have to cope with, and unfortunately we have to take measures that do not please the general population, but we have to take them so that we can save everyone, and so that we are ready to fight the disease post-lifting of all measures.
No, indeed. And just pick up on that point, and maybe Dr. Saini can comment on this or Chipego. So we've seen different models of these lockdown measures. On the one extreme, we've got China and maybe even South Africa, complete lockdown essentially of the whole economy. The other extreme, the countries like Sweden, where there's hardly any lockdown. I mean, schools are open, bars are open, and all the rest of it. Then we've got what we could call the middle of the road, what we have in Zambia, for example, which is a lockdown, but not quite a lockdown. What's your perspective on these different models, and what's your sense of what we've done in Zambia?
To be quite honest, we cannot take the example of Sweden. There is a different culture there in even applying all the social distancing measures. And you are talking about a very developed country and very educated population.
Right.
We can't also take the example of China and of South Africa.
Yeah,
we do rely on imports. We do rely on an informal market. It is there, and therefore I don't think. Although as a doctor I should say we have to do a complete lockdown, etc. But at the end of the day, you do that, you push the population to not respect the rules.
Yeah.
Better to set up measures that are going to be well followed up. Look at the example of masks that now is mandatory. We removed them just for the sake of this presentation. But if we go on the streets, we see almost everyone having a mask. What we have to do is to continue providing appropriate masks, because also we are seeing some fake products on the market, and here Zam has to play an important role. But the measures that have to be taken according to the economy of a country. I know people will say, no, but this is the health of everyone. Well, if everyone is healthy but hungry, it doesn't make a society.
Right.
So we have to balance things. And in my opinion, what we have to do is to promote more social distancing, to promote more hand washing, to work hand in hand in order to bring in clean water to compounds and to markets. We have to be innovative. If we have street vendors and we know that they have to go on the streets every day to sell, for example, for vegetables, what we have to do is to work with ZAM, with farmers, etc., so that we can take the stock that is left at the end of the day and sell it to food processing companies. Therefore, we know that there is an income there for 2-3 days, and then the street vendor will come in a few days later. So, I don't know.
Yeah, no, indeed.
I feel like he said everything I wanted to say.
Okay.
But in general, you can't copy and paste the
Right.
solution. We really have to be very practical about how Zambia deals with COVID-19. So I think from the outset, as a country, we've heard the Minister of Health talk about the fact that Zambia is following a phased approach, and we're analyzing what's happening as it happens, and we're projecting and seeing how best to respond.
Yeah.
So that's probably, I would say that's probably the best approach for Zambia, especially given the fact that we are quite dependent on our neighboring countries, and a full lockdown would be quite difficult to implement. And if you're looking at the social aspects of a full or total lockdown, there are a number of challenges that would arise out of that,
Right.
which would likely cause more harm than good.
Yeah.
And so it's important that we are all observant, we pay attention to what needs to happen. What do we need to do? We need
Yeah.
to practice good hygiene. We need to
Yeah.
do all of these things, and we need to be very vigilant about that. So, we have to look at it from a very practical perspective and say, if we're talking about the markets and keeping, our people safe in the markets or high density areas, how are we going to do that? And we have to look at it very critically and say, what measures can we put in place to reduce the risk on the people who are coming from high density areas or are operating in markets? And I think there are a number of instances where you can learn from what other countries have done.
Right.
Specifically, if you're talking about selling of vegetables, for instance, in a market, what you see from other economies is, the marking out, even in the market, not just, in the chain stores,
Right.
but you actually see in the market people marking out that distance and saying you can't come, you can't be so close to each other. And those are the sorts of measures we need to adopt going forward and say, how do we protect the health of the Zambian people whilst ensuring that we create this balance? Because we do have to remember, we cannot forget the fact that we have a Eurobond to pay.
Yes.
And that revenue needs to be generated.
Right.
That revenue can't be generated if everyone, for instance, is on a full and total lockdown. So we have to consider how to balance that out. And again, I'll go back to the issue where we're talking about, productive sectors have to remain productive. They have to continue producing. They have to continue to raise that revenue. It's absolutely necessary if we want to survive post-COVID.
Sorry, just a quick comment. Because the same way we say there is no rules of parenting. In COVID-19, there are no rules.
Right.
If you look at the reports, for example, for Africa, just to stress on that particular point, even the recent reports from the UN agencies, from
Right.
CDC, from wherever you want, even from your company, we are saying we may have 122 million people affected to 1 billion people affected. We may need $44 billion to be injected in Africa, and we may need $446 billion.
Very broad range.
We don't
Right.
know. We don't know because it will depend on the measures that every country has to take without copying the neighboring country or another.
That's a really good point. So you can't copy and paste,
Yeah.
but also the basics pattern, the very basics, wash hands, sanitization of hands.
Additionally, I just wanted to say something, Mr. Moderator. COVID-19 can be, described like an operational risk event, whose arrival you did not envisage. such that you see even the level of preparedness to handle this kind of calamity is actually is not adequate. So now with COVID-19, like the doctors talked about, we don't actually know when the medication will be found, when the vaccines will actually be developed. So now, which country can withstand a lockdown, say, for example, exceeding 18 months, going up to 2 years? No country right now under the sun can actually do that, because it wasn't actually envisaged in the first place. So now these are the lessons that are going to learn post-COVID going forward to say, but can we set aside probably can we craft some strategies which may entail setting aside some, capital buffers, financial buffers to do with this. In a nutshell, there is no country which can sustain a prolonged lockdown. See, we don't know exactly when the vaccines will be discovered. Already, even the strongest, the biggest economy is the US. The president is constantly talking about having to return to normalcy. And evidently they just have to do that, otherwise see, they don't have an infinite resource base from which they can keep on expending to sustain these measures.
No, really good point. I would like now to move on to the measures governments have taken to try and address or mitigate the impact of COVID. So since phenomenal measures globally, the US have pumped in, I think, $2 trillion to try and keep that economy afloat. In Europe, the UK are paying the payrolls of private sector companies just to try and keep them on those payrolls and keep those companies afloat. Locally here as well, our own government has announced a number of measures. Let's just try and unpack some of these measures. What's your perspective on what government has announced so far, both from a fiscal and monetary perspective? Chupego or Janishas?
Okay. I go first. First of all, let's understand the framework, or the rationale, behind coming up with all these economic policy measures, or if you like, stimulus packages to help these economies. The fundamental aspect is that, first of all, let's deal with the human capital issue now. So let's pump in all the resources into human capital, sacrifice a bit of short-term rising economic costs. But the fundamental aspect is to look at the long term. The long term, we are better off if you have we preserve lives. Also, it will be good for the economy in the long run. So all these, stimulus packages from the monetary front, from the fiscal front, they are aimed at making sure that we prevent the amplification of this economic downturn. That the economic fallout, if we don't attend to it, may be so severe that the time we are past COVID, it will be very difficult to sustain the economies, and it will take a long time. And the cost of that will actually be too high. So now, from the fiscal side, what the government has basically done in terms of the outlay, set aside 2.5 billion kwacha to deal with, first of all, the suppliers of goods and services, the contractors, falling in that category, the backlog. The banks as well have been given some money to deal with, I think, those payroll-related sort of areas so that they can create, they can service that. Basically, to pump liquidity into the banking sector. Even the most vulnerable, being the retirees, the government has had to, pump in money into public service pension fund to clear those. So, essentially, all these from the fiscal front is meant to lift aggregate demand. So to see, we have to make sure that businesses continue operating. Also, the tax incentives. Tax incentives have been crafted in the mining sector. There was the removal of import duties on mining concentrates.
Right.
Also, the removal of export duties on products like crocodile skins and the like. All these are calculated to ensure that we keep the businesses afloat. Let them not, go down. The monetary front, the Bank of Zambia has come up with 10 billion medium-term refinancing facility, and I think this is for the purpose of preserving the financial sector. Financial stability, Mr. Moderator, is actually key in the sense that without it, then the economy crumbles on its back. We need a very stable financial sector for the sake of, for a lot of good things. One of them being the credit has to flow. Financial intermediation is very, very important. So, and also for monetary policy, there's some monetary policy talk about, having to ensure that, the monetary authorities intervene to control interest rates. When the financial sector crumbles, that is not possible. So what the 10 billion medium-term refinancing facility is meant to do, among other things, is to ensure that the banks are given some liquidity support. We know banks have already lent to some highly distressed sectors at the moment. We're talking about tourism. The sports industry, by the way, is also another sector which has been hardly hit. I'm told Amos Hotel was closed, Intercontinental and Golden Peacock Hotel. So we're saying, what we're basically saying with this kind of package is that, see, yes, we have lent to these sectors, and definitely the expected inflows will not be there. So what the banks do, essentially, I think, not to belabor the point, is that in the process of doing their business, they take a calculated risk. The mismatch risk. They mismatch the maturities of their assets on one side, like when they give loans, as well as their abilities. So they know, of course, through experience, that a certain amount will come in and a certain amount will actually go out. Now, when the assets have become toxic, essentially that means they're not going to have the inflows that you expected. So if not given some kind of support, that eventually leads to the crunch. The financial sector will actually crumble. So then this kind of support is intended to ensure that this does not happen.
Right.
So in a nutshell, I think this is all to make sure that you see the banking sector is kept afloat. There's also monetary stimulus. Everything is basically what I'm trying to say, Mr. Moderator, is the fact that let's try as much as possible to just sustain these businesses, to lift demand such that, see, once we get out of it or behind this crisis, we will at least not have a failed economy, a failed financial sector.
Yeah. There's life after COVID.
Yes.
What are you seeing from the manufacturing side? Are you happy with the measures that have been put in place?
Well, of course, we had a laundry list of requests, I must say. So we have collected from the various subsectors that we represent as an association various measures that we thought were important to consider as part of the response to COVID-19. But what we've seen so far is the suspension of statutory instrument number 90, which was really looking at disallowing VAT claims on certain consumables such as spare parts, lubricants, all of which are major inputs into manufacturing. You can imagine machinery usually, if you're with regards to power cuts and so on, the impact of that on machinery, you need a lot of spare parts. Yeah. So that was a big one, in the first address from the Minister of Finance in terms of tax relief. And we also saw more recently the waiving or the potential to waive tax penalties and interest from the ZRA for certain manufacturers. That's also a good measure, very commendable, from the Ministry of Finance. And also, I think the no duty being paid on ethanol, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, which is particularly important, especially for the manufacturers who are involved in the production of sanitizers, for instance, or cleaning materials. So there have been some measures put in place. But that's not to say that was all the measures we were considering. Of course, it comes down to the fact that you need to balance tax relief with the fact that the government still needs to run and that revenue is still required. So it's an important balance that's being struck there. But one of the major conversations now is in and around the cost of energy, right? So last year we saw the cost of electricity basically go up by over 200% in some sectors, over 100% for manufacturers. And of course we haven't completely addressed the problem with regards to load shedding and the capacity to generate electricity. However, at this time when we're saying more local production, we're talking about the fact that we need to source locally. Manufacturers are obviously under a lot more pressure to produce and therefore need a steady supply of affordable energy. So that's one of the areas where we would have looked at and said, look, there might be an opportunity here to incentivize or to support the growth of the sector by reducing the cost of energy. Beyond that, there are the discussions around fuel and oil in particular, seeing what's happening in the global markets. I think the expectation from the Zambian population as a whole was really that we would see some sort of reduction in the cost of diesel, petrol, all of which again are inputs into the manufacturing process. If we are experiencing load shedding, we mitigate that by buying diesel generators and or investing in solar, but currently more on the diesel generators. And if we're buying more diesel, I think that's one of the areas where we would call for some relief at least in the reduction of the pump prices.
Yeah.
So I think there's still a lot of discussion to be had around what measures can be put in place to support businesses. But again, I'll come down to the intervention, which is so key at the moment for the manufacturing sector, and that's really around the value chain development. The fact that we are actively promoting the production and procurement of locally manufactured products, and supporting the farming sector as well. That is important to what he was talking about specifically with sustaining. We need to be able to sustain. We need the economy to run, and beyond that point to build on that.
Yeah. So local sourcing really critical.
True.
I think duties have also been reduced or removed from medical supplies, Dr. Sahili. Is that helping your sector?
We have a large number of medical supplies that are already exempted, and I think that everyone is working with the ministry and the ZRA to see what other goods that are in direct need for hospitals and clinics, so that they can also benefit from some incentives. On that note, just with the hotels, for example, when we say that we need to be innovative, our recommendation, and this is what we have done as a group in addressing the situation, is to, for example, we know that the tourism sector has suffered a lot, and hotels some of them have closed temporarily. What they can do during this closure is to e-train people on fire drills, on hospitality trainings, etc., so that they can enhance the services post-COVID-19. And also the employees who are asked to go on leave, I know that they have planned to go on leave, for example, during the end of the winter or etc. But now we have to be responsible. So if you can go on leave now and you don't have anything to do at work, well, do it, and next year you will have your leave on the period you would like to. But now we all have to be responsible, managers, employees, etc. And there is another thing regarding the news that are circulating, mainly the fake news on WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups, unfortunately. And one of them is kind of, not a fake news, but it's the way we are addressing the news to the general population. We have to remember that they are not all economists or financials or doctors or etc. So when we say that the price of the fuel has dropped worldwide, that doesn't mean that on the spot the fuel price will drop in the country. And that doesn't mean that the government, for example, is not supporting. I'm not here to defend anyone, whether public or private sector,
Right.
but I'm just trying to say is when you read an information, don't take it for granted. Go and Google and try to understand and ask. And then if the answer does not suit your expectations, then you can comment, and because we are seeing a lot of people, like a real panic on Facebook, mainly when they give me the reports that people are fighting because of that or this. I mean, obviously, if we have put the full information, a credible information, we wouldn't be there. So this is all, again, I mean, ZAM and all the other associations, they can help in providing a proper platform for people to send a question and to be answered with reliable information.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point, a very important point. Now, talking about measures, the one point I'd like us to discuss, which is a big elephant in the room, is the debt issue. So if you think of our spending side, 90% of what we collect is spent on public salaries, but a big chunk, 40% at the last count, goes on debt repayment. What's our perspective on what's being done to try and rein in on that in terms of the current measures? Delicious.
Yeah, thanks. What would be good to note that, is that there's been a global effort around this matter of having to provide debt relief, especially to financially distressed economies. We have had the G20. They had a meeting, to discuss the rescheduling of the debt service, the debt repayments, at least to provide some kind of relief in the near term. The government of the Republic of Zambia also is engaged, is actually been actively looking into those possibilities. It has been in touch with first of all the ongoing issue of the IMF program. That is still is pretty much in place. The Minister of Finance said that had a virtual meeting with the IMF is it last week.
Right.
So that's still live, but obviously that money takes so long to come through.
Right.
But we're looking at COVID refunds, which you can quically have access to, you can unblock. So we're looking at those alternatives. We're also looking at also the African Development Bank. What extent can the ADB come in and offer this, as well as the Afrexim Bank? Because already before COVID, the fiscal space was kind of getting constrained in terms of debt service obligations. Something which is actually good enough. We have had to first of all invest in the public capital, road infrastructure, whose dividends will be realized in the long term.
Right.
But obviously, see, some things we didn't foresee. So already the space was constrained. But so to speak, right now, there's a global concern. That those countries whose capability to service state will be is slow, and if we don't give them relief, even the COVID measures, the kind of support, financial support they can give to fighting the pandemic will not actually be there. The resource, there'll be a big resource constraint. Yes, to answer the question, yes, the minister in his last address actually talked about the fact that they're still talking with these institutions.
Very good. Excellent. So we've talked about the macro issues and the impact on, the whole country. I'd like us to delve a little bit on company level issues. So companies are obviously being impacted adversely. It's impacting the revenues because they're not open, therefore they're not selling, their profitability is going down, and in turn, liquidity is being impacted. Based on your experience, are there measures companies can take themselves at company level to try and keep afloat? Any thoughts, comments?
Well, companies, they have to, this is not a choice. There is a crisis and we have to cope with it. We don't want to, then we have to blame no one for a closure in the future. We have seen, again, innovation in some ideas. We have seen an expansion in the business of deliveries, an expansion in the business of ICTs, solutions that have been now provided to us. If anyone has an idea, I think it's time to put it on the table. If you think that you can provide a software or a tool, an educational tool on tablets, don't think that this is not coming in. Please put it on the table, and you will see that a lot of people are interested in that. We know that, for instance, there is a liquidity shortfall. This, we have to cope with it. How we can do? By reducing our operation costs.
Right.
And I think everyone knows in his or her company how to do so. So there are certain measures that are hard to take, but the most important is to be very transparent with the team. Just not saying that we are living the normal course of business and everything is fine. If, for example, we have to take a choice between stocking up goods because we know that prices are going up and providing the extra benefits that we used to provide to our employees, then I think the choice is to go for the extra stock. If we don't have the same way as it goes for macro, it goes for micro. If we don't show that we are ready, then who are we going to serve post COVID-19? I think it's time. Yes, we pay a lot of money on energy. It does cost us a lot of money, but it's also time to educate our employees how to save energy, so that we can save some kwachas. And if you add them all together, then you will see that the results is quite high. We need to reduce our telecom spendings and to use the alternative solutions that are web-based. We need to look at what service can I provide to people who are under a COVID-19 crisis today? For instance, I will take the example of a hospital. If we know that people today, they don't want to come to a hospital because they are scared, which is their right, then we have the obligation to provide them a telesurveillance opportunity, so that one, I keep on some cash flow, and two, I keep on providing a service that is that is looked for by a patient. And I don't do that without going to the public authorities, because one of the things one of the lessons that we have learned at Medland is that some of the measures we have taken during COVID-19, they will still be applicable post-COVID-19. And therefore, we have to do things right from the beginning. I don't know, from a manufacturing perspective, I have seen a lot of manufacturers that are really doing a great job, and they are coping with the crisis.
Yeah. No, indeed. Anything specific?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there's a lot of innovation that has come about as a result of COVID-19, because we do have to cope, we're forced to cope with it. So as manufacturers, I think one of the key things that happened right at the beginning of the pandemic, when we began to see that it's going to have serious impacts, for instance, on our cash flows, is to really relook at the budgets that we created towards the end of last year, and look at those lines and establish where we can make savings from. And this is not to say that to immediately let go of people, for instance, because we know that's a conversation that's been ongoing with regards to the Employment Code and the Ministry of Labor. But rather to see, how do we sustain our operations? How do we ensure that our workforce remains empowered, is able to do their job, but at the same time ensure that we're creating some savings in there. So there are innovations with regards to how you deliver your route to market. How to do that more cost efficiently, how you save on energy, definitely a big conversation, because you may be looking at your plant and you put in place energy saving campaigns, for instance, when you leave your office, switch off the light. It does actually add up to quite huge amounts at the end of the day, if everyone is implementing even those small things within their space. So I think there's a number.
You're reducing the load shedding, by the way.
Precisely.
When you save energy, you're reducing the load shedding.
Absolutely, you're helping everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, I think it's an effort all around. It's not just the government who has a responsibility to respond to COVID. It's the companies, it's the people. We all have something to do in the context of this pandemic in order to ensure that we come out of it better.
Really important point. So one of the things that we've also seen, certainly in the industry I come from, professional services, is this concept of home working.
Yes.
So you're not going to the office, but you're working from home. And with enabling technology, whether it's the internet, Zoom, Skype, it's quite powerful. And there's a school of thought which says this might stick post-COVID.
Yes.
What might this mean after COVID, Demetrius?
It's a very good question, and I think a question which some sectors of the economy would not definitely want to address. What comes immediately to mind is the commercial real estate. If home working is going to materialize and be a permanent feature of our working lives, it will mean there will be no demand for big office spaces. That definitely just collapses. So that is one sector which is likely to be badly hit. Then the other sectors, the other issues have to do with public transport. There's daily demand for people to move from the residential areas to go to the working places. But now, if working from home becomes a reality, then definitely the demand for public transport goes down, and with it also commensurate, obviously, the demand for fuel it will also plummet. Then there's some other things that we may actually not even immediately think about. Things like when you're working from home, there's no need to come out smart like the way we are So, there will be some other services which will obviously be affected. For example, do you have to go to a barber shop to look good? Do I have to go to a salon to have my hair look, in such a way? So, such, and obviously also apparel, those, businesses which are, which retail, clothes, and those obviously in the long run they'll be affected, because I think there is no need for me to have to go to, a boutique and buy expensive clothes.
Right.
When I know that I'm not actually turning up to meet people, clients, and the like. Yeah. So I think those which come to mind, those obviously will be negatively impacted.
Yeah.
But positively, we have seen a shift in corporates to open space workstations.
Right.
And I know that some people, they still want their office to be closed and they want their big desk, but I think this is one of the, by reducing the area that will be needed for offices, I think people will be shifting to open space. But one of the indirect advantages, to be quite honest, is enhancing the transparency. And that's very important because now everything is written. You have to send an email for a request and you have to wait for an answer in written. And you have to do it by Zoom, for example, or any other platform, but it will be recorded. And therefore, your application, let's say you are submitting an application for any service, any public service, you have to submit it online. You don't know who is going to see it behind that laptop. And if what you are submitting is proper, is correct, then this, in my opinion, is one of the positive aspects, which is enhancing that transparency. For the public transport, I think they have also to be creative and to maybe shift to a number of services that are provided by by transport companies that will help. For instance, we did not see up till now any transport that is related to people living with disabilities. And those people, they need to have a public transport that is dedicated to them. Maybe it's an opportunity to shift some of our, or a percentage of our public transport towards those categories.
Yeah, very good. Now, really powerful point. So again, there's potential for innovation here. Now, before we wrap up, there's one point that I'd like us to discuss, and maybe it's again yours, Dr. Sahili. So, New York has been badly hit by COVID. And I think it was yesterday or the other day, there was an interesting statistic. So they're now doing these random tests to try and get a sense of how widespread the disease is. What they found is that up to 20% of the people in that city have been infected without even knowing.
Yes.
Now, if we assume that that might apply here as well, what might that mean for public health policy? What does that mean?
That is a fact. We know that 15% of the population will be carrying the virus. So 21% in New York recently announced. I think we're still in the range. What does that mean is that we have to keep the measures that are put in. Social distancing, because for instance, at Medland, we have we are now at our level 2 of response to COVID-19. What does that mean? We do consider everyone, including myself, as COVID-19 positive, and everyone facing me as COVID-19 positive until proven the opposite, which we cannot prove. So for this is why even in our elevators we cannot face each other's. The measures, I think what does that really means is that the measures that are being put for public health safety are to be kept in until we figure out how to deal scientifically, medically with the coronavirus. Social distancing, hand washing with soap, and proper hand washing, and this is why I think we always call people to release more videos on hand washing, because the more we spread information, the better it is, and this is how we raise awareness. Hand sanitizers, and for those who believe that only imported hand sanitizers, those are the efficient ones, then no. A hand sanitizer is a simple manufacturing process, and I think with ZAM logo on a product, you can just certify that this is a proper hand sanitizer. So let us not complicate our lives, but let us consider that for at least a period of 6 to 12 months, we have to live in that era where everyone is to be considered COVID-19 positive.
Right. Thanks for that, Dr. Sahili. Now, as we wrap up, maybe I'll just go around the table, maybe 2 minutes sort of final thoughts from each one of you. I'll start with Denishas here.
Thank you. There will be a very good lesson to learn after the COVID pandemic has faded. This lesson will apply both to all sectors of the economy, to the government sector, to the household sector as well, to manufacturing, to the business sector. The issue is that all the sectors must be able to gradually build enough financial buffers to be able to withstand a prolonged crisis. Because right now, what essentially everybody is doing is actually firefighting, coming up with quick fix kind of solutions. But then if it be mandated, it be made mandatory by the government to say, let each business, for example, build up financial buffers to cover, for example, for 6 months of operating expenses, especially related to staff costs. So that once you're hit with a shock, an external shock, the thing don't immediately tend to is to retrench, to lay off workers. The government in turn also has to progressively also build up some capital buffers to withstand a shock of this magnitude. Even at household level, I mean, employees, it's better that employees are also mandated to say, can you, build savings, and such savings to be somewhat locked up in somewhere an employee, a worker cannot have access to. Such that once we are hit by a crisis like this one, you see, everybody at least knows we've got something to fall back on before we find a solution.
Right. Thank you very much, Denisius. Chipego, final thoughts?
Thank you, Humphrey. I think from my end, speaking to what he said specifically with regards to lessons after this is done, I think for the manufacturing sector, I think the conversation becomes one where we're talking about how sustainable are the interventions that we're doing now. So for instance, I've spoken about the fact that local sourcing is obviously one of the key things to ensure the survival of the economy. It would be a terrible thing if after COVID-19, after 12 months, for instance, then suddenly we forget about the fact that it is important to build our industry. It's important to empower people here in Zambia. It's important to create jobs here in Zambia. So I'm looking forward to post-COVID, I'm sure everyone is, and really to seeing the interventions that have been put in place now with such vigor and such will, sustainably developing. I would like to see Zambia moving from where we are now to that economy that we envisage in 2030.
Right.
And maybe we needed a COVID-19 type of situation
Yeah.
to accelerate that process, because we have been asking ourselves, how are we going to jump from an 8% contribution to GDP to the envisaged 30% contribution to GDP? And in my view, this is exactly how it needs to happen, an accelerated response to ensuring that local products, farmers are being empowered, are being given the space to grow their businesses. So post-COVID-19, I think I'm really looking forward to that sort of scenario and seeing how we arrive at 2030.
Excellent. Profound point, Chipego. Thank you very much. Dr. Sahib, final thoughts?
So true. I think the world needed to be shaken. But I think also that we have to set a rational analysis of the situation without panicking. This is not a drill, unfortunately or fortunately, and whatever decision is to be taken by a CEO, by a public servant, whoever is there to take a decision, is taking the decision that he or she thinks is for the best of the community. But I think also this is an opportunity for us to strengthen partnerships. Since this webinar is hosted by the American Chamber of Commerce in Zambia, I think it's also an opportunity for us, for local manufacturers, for example, or for healthcare providers to seek for partnerships with, let's say, American companies, so that even goods that are imported can be locally produced in Zambia, and why not exported to other African countries. We can now, we have been trying to convince some big companies to come in and produce in the continent, and that was, I think, a very hard mission. But I think COVID-19 is a proper example, because it has hit the supply chain, that this is much needed. We have a lot of resources, but our major resource in Africa and in Zambia is our youth. They are the future, and I think it is our responsibility to think post-COVID-19 how we can best utilize them and train them so that we can together build an economy that can help us reaching our SDGs.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Saeed. And on that note, that marks the end of our panel discussion. A big thank you to our panelists here. Thank you very much for the time you've invested. And thank you to Medland for providing us this COVID-compliant venue. And finally, but not the least, thank you very much to AmCham Zambia for making this event possible. Good morning.